Welcome to the Economic Rockstar Podcast with your host, Frank Conway, connecting brilliant minds in economics and finance.
In this week's episode of the Economic Rockstar Podcast, I speak with Ed Conard, economist, New York Times bestselling author and former Bain Capital partner. We talk about the implications of an economy now constrained by both its capacity for risk-taking and by a shortage of properly trained talent, about how the growing wealth of most successful Americans is not to blame for the stagnating incomes of the middle and working classes, how high payoffs for success motivate talent to get the training and take the risks that gradually loosen the constraints to growth, as well as how well-meaning attempts to decrease inequality through redistribution dull these incentives, gradually hurting not just the 1% but everyone else as well. Ed also outlines a plan for growing middle and working class wages in an economy, and he urges us to stop blaming the success of the 1% for slow wage growth and embrace the upside of inequality, faster growth and greater prosperity for everyone. You can check out all the links, resources and books mentioned by Ed at economicrockstar.com/Edward Conard. Never miss an episode of the Economic Rockstar podcast. Visit economicrockstar.com, submit your name and email, and you will get each episode straight to your inbox.
I don't really think of them as the 1% because success rises from a large pool of failure. You have to talk about all the workers who are working, some of whom are succeeding, many of whom are not. You can't just look at the ones that are successful. You have to look at the entire pool. But why is that pool growing more successful? Well, we've transitioned from a capital-intensive manufacturing economy to an information-intensive economy. And so we have to be ready to defend ourselves after we're weakened by the baby boomers who are going to eat us alive. We're not going to get there with organic growth. There's no way. We're going to need to substantially increase our growth rate. And the best shot we have is to go out and recruit the most skilled people from the rest of the world.
Hi, Frank Conway here, and you're listening to the Economic Rockstar Podcast. I'm so honoured to welcome Ed Conard to the show. Hi, Ed. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Frank.
Ed Conard is the author of the New York Times top 10 best-selling book, Unintended Consequences, Why Everything You've Been Told About the Economy is Wrong, and his recent book, The Upside of Inequality, How Good Intentions Undermine the Middle Class, which reached number 7 on the New York Times Bestsellers list and is number 1 on the New York Times Best Business Book list. He is a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and a former Bain Capital partner. Ed Conard has debated economists, policymakers and journalists on topics related to inequality, the 2008 mortgage crisis and the US budget. He has appeared on television over 150 times, most notably when he debated on Jon Stewart in one of the longest interviews in The Daily Show's history. Ed has also written opinion pieces for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Foreign Affairs and many other respected publications. You can find all the links to Ed on his website, edwardconard.com. Ed, I would love to firstly ask you, before we move on to talking about your books, which I'm very much interested in, is how you initially got into economics, or perhaps moved and branched out from where you were a Bain Capital partner to where you are now.
Yeah, so I have an undergraduate degree in decision sciences, which is, an undergraduate degree in econometrics, if you will. It's an engineering degree, but applied math and decision making. So I had a pretty good background in economics and took a fair amount of economics as part of my engineering training in that subject area. I then went off to business school and then Bain Capital and ultimately Bain Consulting and then Bain Capital. But I worked there for, I'd have to count how many years, 15, 16, 17 years. I was quite successful. I really didn't need to satisfy the demands of customers anymore. I was always very intrigued by economics, didn't feel like I understood it very well. I had a professor in business school who I was very close to, Bruce Greenwald. He's an economics professor at University of Columbia. And he and I would have regular monthly lunches, and we were chatting about economics. And I said I wanted to learn more. He told me to read some economic textbooks. I read those textbooks. I started reading economic papers. At this point, I've probably read thousands of academic papers. I asked him a lot of questions. I debated him on a lot of issues. I think gradually, over a fairly long period of time, the last 8 years, I developed a deeper and deeper understanding of economics. And why exactly I was interested, I guess I'm just interested in how the world works. I was a little bit frustrated. I always felt that there was a lot of political bias in the media on both the left and the right. I thought I could sort it out by reading academic economics. It turns out there's a lot of political bias in academic economics as well. Actually, I was shocked by how much political bias there was. And so I just felt like I needed to dig deeper and deeper and ask people more and more questions and really try to sort out what I thought was truth from propaganda. And I just grew very frustrated with what I was reading in the media, the arguments that I was hearing, the arguments that were taken as truth, and felt compelled to write what I thought my own version, which I felt was, I can call it unbiased. I certainly have a point of view, but I'm always trying to present the other side's point of view in its most favorable light, to not argue with straw men, to not take facts out of context, and to try to put forward the arguments and the counter arguments that are relevant to political decisions that need to be made today with regards to the economy.
Ed, you seem to be an honest economist, and I'm sure all economists are honest, but in terms of what you're saying, having read or come across your frustrations in media and also some of the academic papers in terms of their political biases, you've cut through that and you say it as it is, and you've built up a lot of respect as a result, especially from the likes of economists like Greg Mankiw and Tyler Cowen, who have praised the recent books that you've written.
Yeah, even here, I'll read you the quote, grabbing the book. Here's Larry Summers, who spent a long time debating, said he profoundly disagreed, but he respected the clarity of the argument. And I think it actually, because I've talked to him in private and debated him in private quite extensively, he actually agrees with a lot more of it than he admits. But, I leave that to him to say as opposed to me. But he has a liberal narrative. I have a conservative narrative. What I respected most about it was he's admitting that he understands my side of the argument and the logic of it. And, he goes on to say that it's a valuable contribution because it will really sharpen your thinking. I think it sharpened his thinking.
And that's the thing with economics. There are facts that we can go by, but based on the type of thinking that somebody or an economist would be from, whether it's political or whether it's a school of thought, we could end up expressing or discussing the way the economy is running from our own personal perspectives. And it's very difficult for an economist or those who read the work of economists to come to terms or try to cut through the thinking and cut through the argument. And it causes debate and it breaks up the economic disciplines into different schools. And when you first came across and a lot of these academic papers and a lot of the textbooks that you were recommended by Bruce Greenwald, did you find that very confusing based on the Keynesians or the monetarists or the Austrians that you've read?
Yes, but I didn't belong to any one school, so I felt like I was able to pick and choose the best of each school. And I had no prior history of having to defend my prior positions, my school. So I think people have complimented me, that Kevin Hassett at the American Enterprise Institute, for being a bit like, the Beatles, who didn't have that much musical theory and was able to pick and choose among the various schools and various ideas. What I would say this is what I came to realize, the problem, the dilemma that you're describing. I think there's at least two big problems in economics. One is you never know the counterfactual. What would have happened if we would have done something different? So unlike in a scientific lab where you can run experiments under different conditions, in the real world, you only get to see the one experiment that was run in the real world. Rarely, I think very rarely, do we ever get to see alternative experiments. So you don't get to see the counterfactuals. So you can always say, well, did stimulus make the recession better than it would have been without it? We don't know. And the second is, what matters is what happens in the long run. And so, say, for example, tax policy. Well, it may have very small effects in the short run, but it nevertheless can compound to have very large effects in the long run. We simply can't hold all the constants constant in the long run to be able to factor out the effect of the one thing that we're interested in looking at. And so those two loopholes, for lack of a better word, just have to be constraints on the world, I think prevent anybody from getting to the truth when it comes to larger issues. So what you do find, I think, in economics is a whole bunch of very, very narrowly focused work that may identify facts, but they're so narrow that they're almost unusable on their own. And then the frustrating part for me was there are very few people, particularly on the right and on the conservative side, who are willing to piece all the little facts, all the little indications, all the little empirical evidence into a theory of the bigger picture, and put forward really a theory of macroeconomics is what's happening today. And I do think that my own view differs from a lot of other economists in that I think of it a lot like chess, in that there are two elements that are very important. There's theory, but the theory applies very circumstantially, so that all the theory in the world won't do you a bit of good if you don't understand the circumstances, and the circumstances are constantly changing. And so I find that these schools, if you will, have certain theories, and they behave as if those theories are universal and apply under all circumstances. And so what I often find is they rarely apply under a wide variety of circumstances, and people underestimate, undervalue, underdiscuss, underanalyze the circumstances, and are more interested in talking about these universal theories, which I think don't apply so well. An example of this would be, and I was debating Greg Mankiw not but a couple of days ago after his New York Times op-ed about whether trade deficits reduce unemployment. His argument is no, because they bring savings into the United States, and as long as those savings are borrowed and spent, they recreate the jobs that would be lost to trade deficits. I think that's true. The argument I made back to him was, today savings sit on the sideline unused at zero interest rates. So the incremental dollar of savings, which comes in as a result of the trade deficit, is largely sitting unused, despite the fact that there's zero interest rates. And unless somebody borrows that money and spends it, we're going to get either lower employment or lower wages. I think the circumstances have a big impact on whether or not the theory that he was putting forward applies universally.
Your book that you debated there, well, he touched on it, or he interviewed you on your book, The Upside of Inequality, Greg Mankiw did. And, you know, this exactly is what you're talking about in terms of how you saw the 1% and how they contribute to the economy. Whereas, and also, sorry, I should say that my recent interview with Deirdre McCloskey last week, we touched on inequality, and she says that she's positive. She believes that we need inequality in the economy. That even though she said she comes from initially when she was a student, she was a Marxist, and she's moved on from that, and she believes that inequality is positive and it's needed. So we never kind of got to talk about this. We never fleshed it out in the interview, and I felt this is perfect to actually discuss with you. And I know you did an op-ed on Piketty and Say's research on inequality too, and I'd love to know firstly, is there a conflict of interest or a counter-argument being played out between Piketty and Say's and your own work on inequality?
Well, so a couple of thoughts. The first is, one is, if you look at the updated study they just came out with a couple of days ago, they've finally incorporated the work of Richard Berkhauser, who has shown that middle-class incomes have grown about 40 to 50% since the 1980s. It was satisfying to see that Piketty and Say's have now incorporated that work, that thinking into their work, which reallocates taxes and government benefits and non-taxed income like pensions and healthcare. They've made the effort to allocate that, and when they've done it, guess what? Middle-class wages have not been flat. They've grown at about 50%. What I find, here's my main beef, though. They don't actually make this they don't do anything to prove what they're about to say with their data. They simply assert it, and that is that it's kind of a zero-sum game. It's a fixed pie. And the more money that's allocated to the successful workers, the 1%, if you will, the less money gets allocated to the other workers. And therefore, the rising success of the 1% is responsible for the slow growth of the middle and working class incomes relative to GDP overall. In my book, I make an argument that there are different forces at work which are driving up the success of the most successful workers, and at the same time, slowing the growth of the middle and working class. So let's take the one percenters, the most successful workers. I don't really think of them as the 1% because success rises from a large pool of failure. You have to talk about all the workers who are working, some of whom are succeeding, many of whom are not. You can't just look at the ones that are successful. You have to look at the entire pool. But why is that pool growing more successful? Well, we've transitioned from a capital-intensive manufacturing economy to an information-intensive economy where a company like Google and Facebook can scale up to economy-wide success and not need any external investment whatsoever. They're net cash flow positive all the way to economy-wide success. And so what we have seen in this economy is unlike Ford Motor Company or any other large manufacturer who needs a lot of plant and equipment and inventory around the world in order to be successful and have to share their success with other investors. Today, these innovators, whatever value they're able to capture, they're largely able to capture it for themselves. And so we've seen a large allocation of talent to this lottery-like success. There might, in fact, be an over-allocation, but the more money that gets allocated to that and the more opportunities we find there, the more inequality we're going to see and the more widening of the distribution when we slice off the 1%. Oh, no, it's not the 1%, it's the 0.1%. It's not the point, it's the 0.01%. When you finally slice it off fine enough, what you're left with is all the guys who entered the lottery and basically ended up making a lot of money in that lottery. That lottery pays a lot more money today than it did in the past. It doesn't mean the returns on those lotteries are great because of survival bias. You're not seeing all the failures that are needed to get a small number of successes, which are driving the curve out. Now, what's happening on the other side of the equation with the middle and working class? First is trade with low-wage economies. Now, we know that trade increases the prosperity of America because if the wages that the displaced worker could get weren't higher than the now lower cost of goods, the goods wouldn't be cheaper because the worker would do the work for lower wages. So we know they're able to get jobs at higher wages than the now lower cost of goods. The problem, and so we're better off. The problem is the worker suffers 100% of the downward pressure on wages, but they capture, I'd say, less than 20% of the value of the lower cost of goods. Why? The top 20% of workers account for 50% of the GDP, so they're capturing about 50% of the value. The other 50%, a very large percent, probably close to half, is being captured by retirees that don't work. Another portion is captured by the poor, who largely don't work. And so what's left for the workers is 20 to 25% of the value of lower priced goods for 100% of the cost reduction. I mean, the wage pressure. They might be better off. Depends on how much value there is, but we don't really know. And there's a good possibility that they're not better off because we've seen that they haven't gotten a wage increase for quite a long time. And we've seen this phenomena throughout the world in all high wage economies. The second thing is we run trade deficits. We buy something from Germany. Germany has dollars. That dollar means I owe you a dollar of labor. Rather than using that IOU to buy a dollar of labor of American-made goods, they loan that dollar back to the U.S. They largely buy T-bills. If that money, if somebody would have bought T-bills, is pushed into the banking system. If that money sits unused at zero interest rates, as it does today, then nobody's borrowing the money and putting it back to work to recreate the job. I argue in the book that properly trained talent and our willingness and capacity to take risk are the binding constraints to growth today. And so what happens is that lending, that savings comes back from offshore and nobody's willing to take the risk of putting those savings to work. And nobody has the talent because the properly trained talent will reduce the risk of putting those savings to work. When that money sits unused at zero interest rates, it puts downward pressure on wages. Now, You could say it also puts downward pressure on employment, but of course we can always get to employment at lower wages. We want full employment at the highest possible wages. And then the last thing is that displaced worker, when we move that plant to Mexico, we tell them, hey, don't worry, the entrepreneurs are coming. They're going to put you back to work. But that worker sees, that smart entrepreneur moved to California and he outsourced the employment to China, to Asia. And the engineers who are left behind are designing products and factories which employ Mexican workers. And he says, where's the entrepreneurs who are coming to put me back to work, who are going to compete with each other, who are going to drive my wages up? They say, don't worry, the money's sitting on the sideline with zero interest rates. There's plenty of capital per worker to drive your productivity back. Competition will drive up your productivity and drive up your wages. What he sees is a brain drain, which lowers his wages. He says the smart, talented people, the entrepreneurs, are no longer working to increase my wages. They're working to increase other people's wages. And so that has an effect. And when he gets in line to get a job, he finds in America 40 million foreign-born adults, 20 million native-born adult children, 60 million new adult workers, 35 million of which are low-skilled Hispanic workers, predominantly adults. And he says, geez, they're all looking to the same pool of talent to drive up their wages too. And so if the constrained resources, which are not savings, which are not capital, if the constrained resources are properly trained talent and entrepreneurial risk-taking, unless those workers contribute proportionally to the constrained resources, those resources get spread over more workers, slows down productivity growth, slows down wage growth. Guess what? We see a lot slower productivity growth today than we saw in the past. And so those are the things that are holding back low-skilled wages in the United States and throughout all high-wage economies throughout the world. If anything, the success of the 1% of the most successful workers is putting upward pressure on the employment and wages of our workers. If you look in the United States, for example, we've seen twice as much employment growth as Germany and France since 1980, 3 times more employment growth than Japan at median household incomes, which are 15 to 30% higher. And we're doing that in the United States, shockingly, with 25% of our workforce is scoring in the top third on academic test scores. Sorry to go on at this, but I'm almost done. 45% of our workers score in the bottom third. In Germany, so we have one high-skilled, high-scoring worker for every 2 low-skilled workers. In Germany, you have about a third high-scoring, a third middle, and a third low-scoring. So they have one high-scoring worker for every low-scoring worker, 1 to 1. We're at 1 to 2. They're at 1 to 1, means they have twice as many workers, high-scoring workers per low-scoring workers, as America does. Scandinavia has 4 times as many, and Japan has 6 times as many. So we've been able to take a much smaller pool of talented people, and we've persuaded them to get much better training. They've got more valuable training at jobs at Google and Facebook. And we've levered up their productivity by working in communities of experts like Silicon Valley. But we persuaded them, because of the higher payoffs here, because of the institutional capabilities that we've developed slowly over time through entrepreneurial risk-taking, we persuaded them to get better training, work longer hours, take more entrepreneurial risks, and as a result, produce a lot more demand for low-skilled employment in the United States than we've seen in the other high-wage economies. And you got to say, look, growth can manifest itself in 2 ways, as an increase in employment or as an increase in wages. And what we have seen is a massive increase in employment in the United States as a result of the success of our most successful workers. It is simply not the case that the success of the most successful workers in the U.S. slows the pay growth of the middle and working class. It's putting upward pressure on that. They're different forces putting downward pressure.
And can I ask you, what implications does that have politically? Because we know the debate that's going on, especially from the Republican side with Donald Trump, about bringing jobs back to America, perhaps reducing, I'm not sure this is only a talk, in terms of reducing trade, as you mentioned or alluded to earlier on, to trade with lower income countries or low wage economies. So how do you stand politically there? I don't mean to bring you, I wouldn't mind actually if you wanted to go into that.
Right there. That's the obvious place to go. So look, I think what Donald Trump has tapped into a very important feeling.
Totally.
Even though he's not able to articulate it, even though his supporters haven't been able to articulate it, this is what they're saying. We want the constrained resources, the properly trained talent, the entrepreneurial risk-taking. We want that used for our benefit, not for the benefit of offshore workers, not for the benefit of newly arriving immigrants. That's what they want. And we are mad at the elites on the left and the right who have been uncompromising on trade and immigration. You guys have been unsympathetic and uncompromising, and we're mad about it. Now, what should we do? Number one, we can't make for $20 what we can buy for $2 and think we're going to be successful in the long run. You have to trade with low-wage economies. So we're going to have to depend on progressive income taxes to redistribute the money, because we know those workers are paying a high price for the benefits enjoyed by Americans relative to lots of other Americans who are getting the benefits but not paying the price. So we should not be taxing trade as he proposes. I fully understand his frustration and the frustration of his followers. We should try to persuade them to be using progressive income tax as the alternative. Two, on trade deficits, you look, Germany, China, previously Japan before they retired, and now Mexico as a result of offshore corporate savings, which is slightly different, but all the same. Those four economies are running enormous trade deficits with us. And the effect of it is they are dumping their risk-averse savings onto the United States, and we have no use for those savings at zero interest rates. Our savings, our risk-averse savings, are sitting unused. The argument that they're supplying us with capital, they are not supplying us with risk underwriting capital, the capital that bears the risks of creating jobs. They're saying, I'll fund investments if somebody else takes the risk. We are bumping into our risk-taking capacity. That's why the savings are sitting unused. That's why we see no take-up in the savings. And when you look prior to the crisis, what you find is in the United States, we were funding subprime consumption. We are not funding plant and equipment because on the margin, business is a net contributor to savings. It's not a net user of savings. Okay, we know that rich people didn't borrow against the rising value of their homes and spent like a bunch of lottery winners. The only people who did that were subprime homeowners who had lousy credit ratings to begin with. And we said, I don't know if you noticed it, but your house has risen in value. You have a one-time shot to borrow against your house and spend the money. And they borrowed against their house and spent like a bunch of lottery winners. Okay, that's not a sustainable use of the money. That's not going to grow our economy in the long run. That's not going to increase the marginal product of labor, which is required in productivity to raise wages. What happened in Germany? They funded Greek consumption. Same problem. Just, the geography is a little bigger, so happened in a different country, but it basically is the same problem. They funded unsustainable Greek consumption, and, they're never really getting paid back for it. What happened in China? They built cities full of empty apartment buildings. Nobody had any use for these incremental savings. What's happened since the financial crisis? We've had 8 years without a one-time rebound common in every other recession or depression. We had no one-time rebound, and we've had tepid growth for 8 years. So we have, as money has sat on the sidelines unused at zero interest rates. And that's, what Keynes taught us, is that when the money starts piling up, when the corn starts piling up in the silos, instead of being eaten or planted, we're going to get slower growth, higher unemployment, and lower wages. And what's happening in the rest of the world is they have an abundance of risk-averse savings, more than they can invest in their own economies. And so they're able to run export-based employment strategies by dumping those savings, by investing those savings, by loaning those savings to the U.S. And they largely won't take any risk at all. They buy T-bills. Why? Because they want to use their risk-taking capacity to create their own jobs. And we've allowed the rest of the world, I believe, through trade deficits, to dump their savings on us. So if I was in charge of the world, in charge of legislation, if I was in the political arena of the U.S., I wouldn't restrict trade. but I would restrict trade deficits. And the way I would do it is I'd say I'm going to issue $1 of import license for every $1 of export. Now, in the United States, about 16% of our GDP is imports and 13% is exports. On a downward sloping demand curve, by the time you get to 13/16, remember it's curving downward as you get flat towards the break-even point. We know that at the 16th percent, we're at break-even. Because if the offshore goods were cheaper than making them domestically, we'd be buying more offshore goods. At 16% of GDP, we run out of offshore goods to buy because they're not cheaper at that point. But at 13/16, you're almost to break even. So for almost no incremental value to consumers, we're putting downward pressure on wages. We're taking the responsibility of investing the rest of the world's unused savings. We're destabilizing our banking system. We're antagonizing our workforce whose sentiment has turned against the Democrat and Republican Party, has taken over the Republican Party and said, we're going to start banning free trade. You got guys like Larry Summers saying, and Paul Krugman saying, we ought to increase government spending in order to absorb the excess savings. You don't hear it so much from Larry Summers. He talks about infrastructure spending, but infrastructure spending doesn't do anything if it doesn't increase government spending in order to absorb the savings which are sitting unused at zero interest rates. That's the piece of it he doesn't tell you. So we all agree, hey, don't pay a rich guy like me my retirement benefits, spend it on infrastructure. Sure, that's a good trade-off, but that trade-off doesn't put the risk-averse savings to work, which is what he's ultimately trying to accomplish. So that's the second thing. The third is the U.S. issues about 5 million green cards a year. We also have about 110 million full-time workers. The top 5% is 5.5 million workers. I'll round that to 5 million. Doesn't really matter. 5 million workers who are in the top 5%. Those are ultra high skill workers who drive progress in a knowledge-based economy. There's 7 billion non-Americans in the world. Top 5% is 350 million. Half of those, we don't know who they are. They've never been tested. Half of them are too young and too old. Half of them are never going to move. You get down to a pool of about 50 million non-Americans in the top 5%. We could easily go out and double the number of top 5% workers in the United States from 5 million to 10 million, and we would potentially double the growth rate. I don't know if 1 + 1 is synergistic and it's more than 2, or we're fishing out a pool and 1 + 1 is 1.5. I don't know, but it's probably something close to 2, doubling of our growth rate. Now you look forward into the future and you see two big problems. The first one is we get eaten alive by baby boomers. Our government spending as a percent of GDP is at 35% of GDP. The Congressional Budget Office projects it to grow 9 points over the next 30 years to about 45% of GDP. And debt, which used to be at 30% of GDP, is now at 75% of GDP. After the financial crisis, it's projected to go to 140% of GDP over the next 30 years. So we get eaten alive by baby boomers. And then when we're eaten alive by baby boomers, the Chinese are going to come to, we have to be ready to defend ourselves when we're very, very weak after paying off all the baby boomers who are not going to take no for an answer. And yeah, we might reduce their benefits a little bit, but they're going to have a lot of voting clout. And they're not going to let us get away with not giving them the money and letting them consume it all. And so we have to be ready to defend ourselves after we're weakened by the baby boomers who are going to eat us alive. We're not going to get there with organic growth. There's no way. We're going to need to substantially increase our growth rate. And the best shot we have is to go out and recruit the most skilled people from the rest of the world. And the beauty of this is we know that there's nothing special about our people except that, they've been trained better because of the job opportunities, the on-the-job training they've had, and they have higher payoffs for risk-taking because of the institutional capabilities we have. So we can substantially increase the income of these people by doing nothing more than moving them to the United States. When we do that, we're going to see that is our best shot at growing. It's what gives us a best shot at being competitive in the long run. So those are the three things that I would be doing to be, don't restrict trade deficits, and go out and recruit another 5 million ultra high skilled workers.
So my question is, it's obviously, how do you do all that? How do you restrict trade deficits? How do you stop them? I know you mentioned about a dollar for dollar, 13/16 along the demand curve and trying to export and import a dollar each. But would it be possible, or would this be a wrong thing to do, is to stop the dollar or have the dollar give up its reserve currency status?
See, I don't think it matters. In this sense. I think the reason why the U.S. dollar is the reserve currency is because we're willing to allow large trade deficits. Okay. And combined with the fact that, the U.S. is big and powerful and successful in today's world, people go, hey, if I have excess savings, boy, I can run a trade deficit. I don't mind holding T-bills. I don't mind holding treasuries. They're pretty darn safe in this world. And so it's those characteristics, the safeness of the United States and our willingness to accept trade deficits, which causes everybody else in the world to hold big caches of treasuries. We could give up our reserve currency status and it wouldn't change the fact that people would prefer to hold treasuries, and they want to hold a lot of them because they have the capability, the savings to run. The trade deficit was 5.5%, 5.5% of GDP prior to the financial crisis. We were running up to that for quite a while. I mean, trillions and trillions of dollars. What other economy can absorb that much of the world's savings? But it's real economics. It's not just the reserve currency that's driving this. So if we were able to say $1 of imports for every $1 of exports, and we'll issue a license, the license will have a little bit of value, so it'll reduce the increment on the margin. It's going to reduce imports and increase exports slightly. We'll let it trade freely because we don't care whether we line up with. We only care whether we line up in total, not whether we line up with one country or another. We would very quickly equilibrate at like 14% or something like that. And the difference between 14 and 16 in terms of value created, value captured by customers is a nickel. It's basically break even. It doesn't matter. So I think it's actually quite easy to do. I think the harder thing to do is going to be, and I think that would be a logical compromise with Trump and his supporters who want to restrict trade. We say, look, we can't restrict trade, but we can do this. We get you a lot of what you're looking for. We can't, it doesn't make any sense to restrict trade. We can't make for $20 what we can buy for $2. The next thing we got to do is persuade him on immigration to not cut it all off, but simply to redirect it. Because you say, look, as long as illegal, low-skilled immigrants can come across the southern border, and it's very expensive to stop the incremental one from coming, why would you have legal low-skilled immigration? You have legal high-skilled immigration. And that's what we ought to be converting to. And we're already issuing 1 million green cards a year. So we can, in very short order, go out, we can't all of a sudden start issuing 1 million high-skilled green cards a year. We wouldn't be able to adopt that quickly. But in fairly short order, we can have a substantial impact on the number of ultra high skilled workers we have in the country.
So with these high skilled workers, the 1% contributing to the economy, but also exporting, I suppose, jobs and importing lower inflation perhaps into the US economy. But how could we stop these risk averse savings from coming into the country or redirecting them to, I suppose, more high risk ventures? Is it that these countries like Germany and Japan, there's a clause in it that can't be used? Or like I thought once savings come into the country through the trade deficits, that could be used at the bank's disposal or at their own discretion?
Well, it depends on how much risk the investor, the owner of those funds, are willing to take, right? So what ends up happening is they say, we don't want to take any risk, therefore we're going to buy treasury bills. We say, okay, the interest rate's zero, there's no risk there. And there's the amount of treasury bills isn't a function of economics. It's a function of how much fiscal deficits you run. And so to the extent I'm a risk averse saver who wanted to buy treasuries, if a foreigner is willing to pay zero for them, he pushes me out and I end up, in the banking system, but I don't necessarily go, oh, I think I'll start funding venture capital with my risk averse savings. I go, no, I'm trying to put my child through college. I'm trying to save for a down payment. I need the money 3 years from now. I can't afford to take equity risk. So I'm going to deposit my money in the bank if I don't buy a T-bill. So I might get displaced from one risk averse investment, but I'm going to move to another low risk investment, bank deposits, for example. And then if we put restrictions on the bank that say, hey, bank, you can't make any risky investments. Bank says, geez, I can't lend money to anybody with a credit rating that isn't at least 700. Otherwise, these regulators are going to be all over the top of me. Then we go, there's only so many homeowners with credit ratings at 700, and the money sits in the bank unused and at zero interest rates, and they deposit at the Fed $2.5 trillion of it, excess reserves. Don't need it to support lending. It's excess reserves unused. We go, well, that's not so great. And we've seen slow growth for 8 years.
A lot of the world economy is pretty much growing at a rate, especially the developed countries, they're growing at a rate similar to the United States. So is this something that other economies are experiencing, or are they dependent on the US growing at a higher rate? Because, I know China is benefiting from exporting its low wage and its low-priced products to the rest of the world, and it's growing quite rapidly, and perhaps so too India, but maybe not at a pace it would have liked to be growing. It's like history repeating itself. We had a lot of the Mediterranean countries like Italy hundreds of years ago that have grown quite rapidly, and is it now based on what the Asian economies are doing now? It's practically their turn. They're naturally going to be growing at a higher rate because they're coming from such a low level.
Yeah.
Even though their incomes per GDP per capita is extremely small relative to say the US and Ireland's.
Yes, I agree. It's circumstantial. It's at this point in time, and I don't think it'll continue forever. Okay, so sure, if you have low wages and you can ship things around the world, you're going to capture a larger and larger share of things that can be made with low wages and shipped around the world, which is all manufacturing for the most part. Now, what you find in manufacturing, though, of course, is in order to be competitive, everybody's got to automate, and they got to keep increasing the productivity of their workforce. And gradually, just like agriculture, all the labor is being squeezed out of manufacturing. And once you squeeze all the labor out of manufacturing, you're going to see less world trade, because I don't need to make the stuff in China if I got a machine in the United States, which is basically making it at zero cost or very, very low cost. So do I think that ultimately trade has hit its peak and is going to decline? Yes. Do I think, to the extent that low wage labor can be shipped around the world and is still needed, whether that's through call centers or manufacturing or whatever, yeah, I think it'll continue to be shipped around the world, and that'll put downward pressure on the wages and low skilled wages in the most advanced economies. That said, it's also the case that China has a lot of unused savings. And why should we let them? We should say, look, we'd love to trade with you. We want hey, if Chinese labor is free, how much of it should we buy? All of it. We should be trying to buy as much of it as possible. That's fine. What we shouldn't be doing is saying, but we're going to let you sell us even more by buying treasuries, by loaning us your risk-averse savings, by loaning us money that we have no use for. Okay, we say, you know what, we'd love to trade, and we want balanced trade, and we want to buy as much stuff as possible. And it's very easy for them to buy all kinds of things in the United States that we all find competitive, whether that's Apple products or that's Caterpillar tractors or General Electric jet engines. There's all kinds of stuff in the United States, which is 100% competitive in the entire world. So, anybody who wants to trade, it's very easy to trade with the United States. What's also very easy to do, though, is China would not be growing as fast because they are not putting all their money back to work. In their little corn economy, they're eating it, they're planting it, and they're putting huge amounts of savings into their silo. And we're emptying their silos out for them. Okay, the silos are so full, they're building cities full of empty apartment buildings because some slick salesman has persuaded some worker that's a low risk way to store their savings as opposed to leaving them in the banks. The government has intervened to run companies with a lot of debt and not a lot of equity because they have a lot of debt and not a lot of equity. But what would happen is a lot of their corn would sit unused and the growth rate would be slower as a result of it. That's a problem we're not going to solve for them by letting them run large trade deficits. And, if they want to invest their money in the United States, they can invest their money in the United States. Come over here and build a factory. We'd love to have you come over here and build a factory. fund a cure for cancer.
Yeah.
Try to, do venture capital, underwrite risk that's really going to grow the economy. Otherwise, let your savings sit unused. Not our problem.
Ed, you mentioned the abundance of unskilled labor in the economy. The way technology is going and the way we envision the use of artificial intelligence and robotics, software and hardware that's replacing a lot of jobs. Like even recently, Amazon have come out with their own supermarket whereby you just grab your things and walk out the door and it's all scanned as you're leaving. So there's a vision that we may no longer need those unskilled workers at the checkouts, for example. So we're going to have even more of an abundance of this type of labor. So is that going to be more of a drain on the economy, or is this going to be a positive thing in the long run, do you think, in terms of these people upskilling, or would there be even jobs for these people even if they upskill?
So the answer to that is I think nobody knows.
Yeah.
There's two camps, a positive camp and a negative camp. I will tell you I tend to fall in the optimistic camp, but I'm acknowledging the fact that it's highly uncertain. I think what you find is, and this is my guess as to how it would come out. When they invented a tractor, did it leave a bunch of starving farmers in their wake? No. The farmers, the now lower cost of food made a whole bunch of other jobs economical to go perform. All of a sudden, a person could become a school teacher, a truck driver, a carpenter, a doctor, a lawyer. It's the lower cost of food that made all those jobs, which were previously nobody could afford to do them because they were too busy growing food. And if you didn't grow food, you'd starve to death. That means being a doctor, you're going to starve to death and die. And nobody can afford your doctoring services because they're too busy eating the food that they make. So when the tractor comes along, does it leave a whole bunch of starving farmers in the wake? No. And what would have happened is this. If for some weird reason, those workers, and I'll come back to this, couldn't find work at higher wages, what would have happened? They would have remained farmers and they simply would have continued farming for themselves. So now we say, geez, what about today? Well, the first thing I'd say is, if someone told you that one of the most successful Fortune 500 companies was going to brew your coffee one cup at a time and swirl the milk in order to make it pretty, if I'd have told you that 10, 20 years ago, you'd have told me I was crazy. Okay? And yet Starbucks is on every corner in the United States now. Why? Because goods are cheaper and people can afford to have their coffee brewed one cup at a time. Now, you might go back and say, well, geez, when the tractor came along, it used to be that becoming a doctor or a school teacher was now a more profitable job to do. And now, 150 years later, the only thing left to do is brew coffee one cup at a time and swirl the milk. I'd say, well, no, there's a lot of people working on a cure for cancer too. And it wasn't economical to work on cures for cancer 15 years ago, 20 years ago. There's a lot more people today trying to crack the code on cancer and biology and information and technology, because the lowering of the cost opens up opportunities at all skill levels, high and low. So is there an infinite pool of opportunities, or are we fishing out the pool? I don't know. If we're fishing out the pool, I suspect what you'll discover is at some point the pool gets fished out, and then we go off into a two-tier economy. One is a whole bunch of rich people with an army of robots working for them. They'll probably all use their robots to fight each other and destroy all the capital, by the way. And there's a whole bunch of people that can't afford robots, so they all continue to work for each other at a very, very high level of prosperity, not unlike the level we see today. Okay, it ain't that bad in the worst case scenario. I find it hard to believe you're going to have a whole bunch of people that starve to death. Now, what I really think happens is this. What matters is the ratio of high to low skill workers. And normally what happened in the manufacturing economy is that capital was not only made workers more efficient, but it also is a substitute for supervision. Now, what ends up happening is you say, well, I put this automated machine in and the worker has to now press a button. They don't have to carve a widget and weld it and do all the highly skilled work. Now they just got to load the machine and press a button. So the supervision that's required to get productivity out of a low skilled worker has gone down as a result of the capital investment. But you also have to have a more skillful mechanic and programmer and other people that now have to supervise the capital instead of supervising the labor. And we know with computers, that computer on your desk worked, but every now and then you need a fairly trained person to come along and fix, whatever bug crops up on your computer. You got to go buy a new computer. I don't know how supervision is going to get allocated between unskilled workers, capital, and, you can supervise skilled workers. You can supervise skilled workers in the production of innovation, for example. And I think it's turned out that the production of innovation has been a very attractive place for skilled workers to work and to supervise skilled workers and, if you will, serving skilled workers, whether that's as a waitress in a really high-end restaurant where they get paid a lot of money, or as a masseuse, or as a tutor of a rich person's child, or as a landscape architect, or as an architect. It's very possible that we could get a bifurcation of the economy where one group goes off to work for themselves. It tends to be a higher skilled group with a lot more interpersonal capabilities, if you will. And then another group gets left behind basically to work for themselves. I think that's the very thing that's happening in the United States, because I think it used to be you could export manufactured goods from the heartland of America. And now there isn't that much that you can export out of the heartland of America. So you basically have low-skilled waiters waiting on low-skilled waiters. And that economy is beginning to evolve on its own, independent of the coast. Now, that's not that there isn't spillover, because the coast creates, innovations which end up being used by the heartland. Apple iPhones, for example, Apple phones. But how the ratios, the mixtures, how the value gets distributed between high and low skilled, it leaves us all scratching our head. I don't know. I suspect, 250 years of history has told us that the workers at all skill levels get richer and richer and richer. They may not get richer at the same rate. I have a hard time believing they're all going to go backwards, but I can see a scenario where they don't grow much as fast in the future as they have in the past.
Ed, your book, The Upside of Inequality, How Good Intentions Undermine the Middle Class. Is that the upside of inequality, in that the middle class would be undermined or could disappear, and have the upper and the lower class, or perhaps low skilled and the high skilled labour?
Yeah, what I meant by the title was this, which was the U.S. has a shortage of high skilled workers.
Yes. And
we have been very effective at employing those workers. And we've built institutional capabilities which increase their productivity. And that has produced faster growth and higher wages for all workers in the United States. That's the upside.
Cool.
What are the misintentions? Those are misguided policies that we think are going to bring prosperity to the middle class and don't. Free trade might be one of those. Trade deficits might be one of those. Immigration might be another one if it isn't done properly. There are things that we're doing which I think have not been in the best interest of our middle and working class, and we're beginning to see them get angry and start to rebel. I think there's other policies as well. I don't think increasing the minimum wage, for example, you raise that to $15 an hour. There's a lot of workers who are not able to produce $15 of value that a customer wants to buy. You're pushing those workers out of the workforce. Is that the right thing to do? I don't think it is. In healthcare, you can make everybody buy a really, really high, expensive Cadillac plan, if you will, a Mercedes plan. Is that the right answer? Would it be better to say, I have all kinds of different plans at all kinds of different price points? Here's a plan with a low price. It will give you a lot of valuable care while you're alive. But if you get cancer, we're not going to spend a lot of money saving your life. But you can pick that plan, or here's another plan. You won't get such great care during your life, but at the end of your life, we'll do everything we can to save you. You get, as a consumer, to pick those plans. You do complicated things where you say, let's take all the healthy people, all the healthy young people in the world who we're all going to eat them alive as the baby boomers retire, and then we're going to tax their health care in order to deliver health care to everybody else. I go, that's a good intention, which is undermining middle-class workers. You put a huge tax on their health care to try to pay for everybody else's health care. You're killing them and as a result. So I'm trying to go through many of the policies that we think are good and try to show you what the real effects of those policies are on workers in the middle class.
Ed, can I ask you a number of quick-fire questions, if you don't mind?
Sure.
At the beginning of the interview, you mentioned Bruce Greenwald.
Yes.
And he gave you a number of textbooks to read and papers. And this is a question I tend to ask is, have you any recommended books other than your own that you'd like to suggest to us?
Well, what I started off doing was reading. I'm looking over at my bookshelf. I started reading Greg Mankiw's textbooks for undergraduates. I read David Romer's introductory textbook for graduate economics. I think if everybody who's listening is an economist, it probably doesn't matter because they read those textbooks. I read David Weil's textbook on growth. I read Robert Barrow and Paul Krugman's introductory textbooks is to try to see the difference between the two of them. That's sort of how I got my start. My buddy Bruce Greenwald he co-wrote a lot of Joe Stiglitz's papers. He's very good friends with Joe Stiglitz. I think, if you really don't understand the whole contribution of asymmetrical information and how it's affected economics and some of those foundational papers, I think you're missing a big part of economics, which I think it's I won't say it's been pushed to the side. I think I often feel that it's not fully considered when people start to think about economic issues. I'd probably put that there as a book I think that ought to be read. I spend a lot of time in business. There's a great, great book called Leadership on the Line. I think it's called How to Survive the Dangers of Leading, which I quote from in my new book, The Upside of Inequality. On page 93, I reference a long passage from the book, but that's a book where I really opened my eyes to why do you have to spend a lot of money, for example, to get a CEO to take risk? Why left on their own devices do management teams take less risk than they should be taking? I made a lot of money in Bain Capital by being a very active owner investor who pushed management teams to make a lot more changes, to take a lot more risks than they otherwise would have. I really think that book opened my eyes, lays out the foundations for why you see what Bill Bain, the founder of Bain Consulting, called satisfactory underperformance, why you see so much satisfactory underperformance. I think he really lays out, I won't say I'll call it the economics, but it was a real eye-opener for me. Be high on my list.
Given the amount of writing that you have done, op-eds and your recent books, I'd love to know, do you have any writing tips, even if there was one or even the top 3 writing tips that you could recommend and suggest to us as academics, as students who, or even authors who would like to put work out there in terms of this whole area of economics or finance?
Yeah, I always got A's in writing in school. And then when I started to write my first book, I realized how far away from being a professional writer I really was. I always said that I spent a year writing the book and 4 years rewriting the first book. And then I thought, geez, I know something about writing a book. And when I wrote the second book, I ran into pretty much the same experience. And I still feel like there's a big gap between my writing and what's really required to get published successfully. So some things I learned. One, you have to have very, very strong topic sentences and concluding sentences to every single paragraph. And every argument, every phase of your argument, every subordinated and coordinated element of your argument has to have a lot of signposting and introductory paragraphs and strong theses that really much stronger than you think. Your inclination is to dive into the middle of the argument and start saying X, Y, Z. You really need a lot more signposting and upfront explaining what the organization, what the structure of the argument is going to look like. And what I find often is it takes me, like I said, a year to write the thing, and then it takes me 3 years to do everything that I just described, which is turning it into a real manuscript. So that would be something that's high on my list. Second, I'd say is you learn a lot about your own argument from writing, and you realize that there's weaknesses in your arguments. There's things you haven't thought through completely. Your arguments get much stronger by writing them and really scrutinizing them and actually getting them published. And even now, there's many things in the first book that I don't believe anymore. I've changed in the second book, and there's a few things, even in the second book, where I wish I'd have tightened that up, thought about that slightly differently. I think I have a better understanding. So the whole my whole learning process has been driven by really trying to write it down and clarify it in my own mind. The third thing I'd say is, writing a book is very different than writing 800 words op-ed. And a book is not just a collection of 800-word op-eds. You need an arc that runs over the entire book, that pulls the whole book together into a narrative, into a story, into an arc. And even nonfiction is a lot like fiction. There's foreshadowing and things like that. There's analogies and metaphors and such that help people to better understand the arguments. And many times I think I feel that I can be more persuasive by getting the reader to draw their own conclusion rather than me drawing the conclusion for them. So anytime they have a eureka moment in their own mind, I feel that I've accomplished my objective. I've made my argument even stronger. Another thing I would tell you is there's a concept called a Rogerian argument, where if I say, look, the world is flat, often everybody thinks it's flat, and I say, look, the world's round, let me tell you why you're wrong. You'll go, let me tell you, no, I'm going to try to disagree is what you find people do. It's really have to butter the bread. You have to say, you agree with this, don't you? Yeah, I do. Well, if you agree with that, don't you agree with this? Well, I guess I do. Well, if you agree with those two things, wouldn't you sort of agree with this? Well, I never thought about it that way. And you say, well, if you agree with that, then you whammo, don't you agree with this? I think a Rogerian argument is very powerful, but I also think this, which is going back to my book on leadership on the line. What tends to happen is when I try to persuade you that something is different than you think it is, it's a lot easier for you to conclude that I'm wrong and I'm an idiot than it is for you to change your mind. And so it's very, very dangerous to go out in the world and try to get them to change their mind. Because 9 times out of 10, even when you're right, the person walks away and thinks you're an idiot. They think you're wrong. They think you're dumb. They think you're unworthy. Because it's a lot easier to get to that conclusion than it is to change your mind. And so you need a lot of coaxing and cajoling and evidence and data to come out of that fight, to come out of that debate without having the other person think less of you. And if you have a lot at stake, like you're trying to get tenure, or we used to have an expression at Bain all the time, do you want to be rich or do you want to be right? And, used to say over and over again, people would say, well, I want to be rich. I want to be rich. Eventually we got rich and I started saying, I want to be right. I don't care about being rich anymore. It's very, very dangerous. It's very hard to try to be right. It's a lot easier to try to be rich. You don't have to persuade anybody anything.
Ed, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I'm so honored to have you on the podcast, and I'd love for you to share again with our listeners where they could find you.
www.edwardconard.com, and that's Conard. It's often misspelled as Conrad, but www.edwardconard.com, or at Edward Conard on Twitter. We always announce it. I'm also on Facebook, Edward Conard, again, Conard, and that's how you'll find it. And you can send me an email from there too.
Cool. And you can find all the links to Ed at economicrockstar.com/Edward Conard. Ed, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. You are an economic rock star.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this podcast, why not leave some feedback or comments on the show notes page on economicrockstar.com, where you can also sign up and be a member of the Economic Rockstar community. If you're listening to this episode on iTunes or Stitcher Radio, I would love to have some feedback and for you to leave an honest rating and review, as this will help with the rankings of the show so that more people can find it. If you're listening on the website economicrockstar.com, make sure you check out the back catalogue of all previous episodes and interviews with some amazing professors and authors at economicrockstar.com/podcasts. Thanks for listening, and I really appreciate your loyal support. I know how much you love audio, so why not get a free audiobook with Economic Rockstar today? I've teamed up with audiobooks.com to bring you this amazing offer. Visit audiobooks.com/rockstar to download your free audiobook now.